Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into one of the most absurd corners of medieval warfare. You're probably curled up somewhere cozy, wondering how knights really fought. Swords, lances, maybe a flaming catapult or two, right? Well, imagine instead a battlefield where someone shouts, "Ready your spoons," and means it. That's where we're headed. Not metaphorical spoons, not ceremonial. I mean actual, weaponized, oversized spoons being brandished with the solemnity of a knight swearing loyalty to his king. If you think that sounds ridiculous, you're right, but that's also the charm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your sleepy little corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, you find yourself underground. Not the cold, skeletal tunnels of a dungeon, but a vaulted cellar beneath a long-forgotten castle in the hills of southern France. The air is thick with the scent of damp wood and old stone. Your footsteps echo. Something metallic scrapes under your boot. You kneel down, brushing away dust. A glint. It's not a sword or even a rusty shield. It's a spoon, but it's enormous, nearly the size of a child's sled with a bowl wide enough to cradle, a small pumpkin. Your fingers curl around its handle. Solid iron, decorated with flourishes of a long-lost family crest. You half expect it to whisper ancient recipes or challenge you to a duel. As you lift it, a whisper of parchment flutters from beneath a nearby barrel. Curious, you tug it free. It's a page from what appears to be a diary. Spidery ink scratched. Day in Latin. One line stands out. "Where the ladle is honored, so too shall peace and stew prevail." You blink. This cannot be serious. Except you soon find out it absolutely is. Centuries ago, before the invention of forks was widely accepted, and long before the idea of proper cutlery etiquette, there existed a curious order of knights. They weren't formed by royal decree, nor sanctified by the church. They called themselves the Spoon Brotherhood. And they believed that the greatest weapon against chaos was not the sword, but the spoon. Their origin story? As delightfully ridiculous as you'd hope. During a brutal winter siege, a small garrison found themselves trapped in a monastery with dwindling supplies. The armory had been stripped, and the food rations were barely edible. But the kitchen? Stocked. Wooden spoons, ladles, stirring staffs, even a giant soup cauldron that could double as a hot tub if you were brave or foolish enough. As legend goes, one night as morale crumbled and hopes froze, a young knight named Emmerich stirred a pot of barley stew with such dramatic purpose that the others mistook it for a rallying speech. Inspired, and perhaps delirious with hunger, the soldiers repurposed the kitchen tools into a makeshift armory. That night, they repelled an ambush with ladles, soup bowls strapped to their arms, and, crucially, a boiling stew thrown from the battlements like medieval napalm. Their attackers retreated, not out of injury, but confusion. It was from this chaos that the idea was born. What if culinary tools could become tools of peace, or absurd intimidation? Fast forward a generation, and the Spoon Brotherhood was holding informal gatherings, cloaked in the kind of secrecy normally reserved for heretical cults or amateur chess clubs. They exchanged stories, crafted giant spoons, and eventually adopted a motto: "In broth we trust." You find yourself wandering deeper into the cellar. The stone walls are covered in chalk drawings, battle diagrams involving soup pots, ambushes planned with soup ladles, and something that looks suspiciously like a trebuchet flinging porridge. There's even a depiction of a man in full armor, slipping on gravy. You pause. Are these the ramblings of some forgotten cook with a flair for drama? Or the first breadcrumbs of a movement that truly existed? You feel something shift beneath your boot again. Another object. A spoon-shaped medallion, bronze with a tiny notch in the handle that resembles a crown. It looks ceremonial, ritualistic, or maybe it just held up someone's oversized cloak. Outside, the night wind howls against the crumbling stone. Inside, your heart races, not with fear, but with the thrill of forgotten absurdity. You're beginning to understand that history didn't just march forward with swords and speeches. Sometimes it waddled along carrying soup, and perhaps, just perhaps, that's a more accurate reflection of how people actually lived. They cooked, they spilled things, they laughed at nonsense. And some of them, it seems, fought wars with spoons. Not because it was efficient, but because it was what they had, and because it made them unforgettable. Of course, modern historians dismiss all this as folklore, half-truths brewed from bored monks and exaggerating bards. But some inscriptions remain. And that spoon in your hand, it's very real. Heavier than it looks, balanced perfectly at the wrist. You swing it gently, it hums. Somehow, you know this is just the beginning. You step carefully across the uneven stones, the massive spoon still gripped in your hand. It's awkward, ridiculous, and yet oddly majestic, like wielding a dinner plate with delusions of grandeur. You turn a corner in the cellar and find a spiral staircase, half swallowed by ivy and years of neglect. It creaks as you descend, but below there's light. Faint, flickering, not electric, torchlight. You duck into the corridor, brushing cobwebs from your face, and there it is. A chamber. Carved in ancient stone, its walls lined with murals. No saints, no noble kings, just men and women in armor, holding spoons. Some gleaming, some bent, all glorified in poses typically reserved for epic sword fights. You half expect them to start moving, like knights in some enchanted cookbook. At the center of the room is a long stone table. On it sits a scroll, surprisingly well preserved. You unfurl it. The parchment crackles, releasing the scent of time. Candles smoke, mold, and something faintly herbal. Written in looping, reverent script are the words, "Minutes from the second. Council of the Spoon Brotherhood." And thus, you learn about the Order of the Spoon. The Brotherhood wasn't merely a joke taken too far. Over time, it evolved into a fully fledged military society. Still informal, because no kingdom would officially endorse warriors who could be defeated by a firm whisk, but serious in their own way. They met every spring in abandoned kitchens and castle basements, far from the scrutinizing eyes of proper knights. There, they would share new spoon-based tactics, debate the ethics of stew deployment in conflict, and induct new members via a deeply solemn ritual involving stale bread, 3 ladles, and a vow that ended with, "May your broth never curdle." You imagine the scene vividly now. Picture 20 grizzled men in mismatched armor standing around a cauldron, chanting in harmony while someone drops in an onion like it's a sacred relic. Is it satire? Sincerity? History never clarified. But the Brotherhood grew. Quietly, quirkily, like yeast in warm dough. They even had ranks: the stirrer, the leader of each regional chapter; the dipper, second in command and designated soup sampler; the scraper, responsible for cleaning up the battlefield and the pots; and the whiskless, new initiates who hadn't yet earned their spoon. No one could accuse them of lacking creativity, but don't mistake whimsy for weakness. One of the earliest records of their involvement in actual battle comes from the Siege of Grendel's Hollow, an event largely ignored by serious scholars because, frankly, it sounds made up. But you know better now. According to surviving accounts, the Spoon Brotherhood was hired to break a months-long stalemate. The enemy was dug in, refusing to surrender. Traditional armies had failed, so the Brotherhood proposed something radical. They set up camp just out of bowshot, unpacked their oversized spoons, and began a public cooking ritual. Morning, noon, and night, they made thick, fragrant stews. The wind carried the smell over. The walls, onions, garlic, roasted root vegetables, and slow-simmered rabbit. After a week, morale inside the besieged town had crumbled. Not from starvation, but from jealousy. Deserters snuck out at night begging for a bowl. Eventually, the commander surrendered, not with a sword, but a ladle held high in truce. You stare down at the scroll and notice something new. A crude map sketched in one margin. It shows castle kitchens and soup routes, drawn with military precision. There are arrows marked stew offensive, broth withdrawal, and, no joke, split P-flank maneuver. Your smile stretches as you imagine two opposing generals trying to explain this to their superiors. Yes, we lost the eastern wall. No, it wasn't fire. They served dumplings, with a nice garnish. Still, not everyone was amused. In the scroll's postscript, a bitter note warns of internal schism. A group of more traditional knights wanted to absorb the Brotherhood, to force them into proper tactics and make them drop the Spoon nonsense. The Spoon loyalists refused, and so, for a time, there were Spoon civil wars. That phrase alone makes you pause and blink. You imagine clanging battles, where soup ladles met polished steel, where pot lids were strapped to forearms like shields, and where someone yelled, "For the broth!" with absolute conviction. Of course, modern historians are split. Some dismiss the Spoon Brotherhood as satire recorded by bored scribes. Others believe it was real, perhaps not widespread, but undeniably sincere. There are too many artifacts, too many marginal notes in monastic records, too many murals of armored cooks holding culinary weapons. One such mural looms before you now. It's faded, but clear enough. A knight with a giant spoon raised above his head, standing in front of a group of ragged soldiers. His eyes are kind. His spoon, dented, well used. The inscription below reads, "He who stirs, unites." You run your fingers along the stone. The surface is cool, slightly gritty. You can't help but laugh under your breath. You came here expecting silence and stone. You found soup and satire. And, oddly, inspiration. Maybe history isn't about power and blood alone. Maybe it's also about the strange, the silly, the utterly human urge to turn everyday objects into something bigger than ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, that spoon in your hand isn't done telling its story. Your fingers tighten slightly around the massive spoon's handle as you leave the mural chamber. Somewhere above, dust drifts lazily in a shaft of moonlight. Silent, soft, like the breath of history itself, exhaling after centuries of being forgotten. The passage ahead narrows. The torchlight dances over stone as you duck into another small alcove, where a heap of old parchment, cloth, and crumbling leather-bound tomes sit half-buried in time. One of them catches your eye. On its cracked cover, drawn in fading ink, is a bowl of stew being served by a knight in full armor. You open it. The ink is shaky but legible. It's not a history book. It's a recipe journal. Sort of. Scrawled in the margins are notes about military tactics, personal commentary, and an odd number of soup evaluations, a phrase in bold, siege soup and strategy. Yes, you read that right, because apparently there was a point in medieval history where someone said, "Let's solve this war with stew," and no one stopped them. The siege of Castel Venison was brutal. Supplies were low. The defenders inside were surrounded, desperate. But the attackers, led by the Spoon Brotherhood, had an idea no one else dared try. Culinary warfare. They didn't rush the gates. They didn't starve the town out. Instead, they built a fully operational outdoor kitchen just outside the southern wall. Massive cauldrons, smoky fires, gigantic iron spoons stirred bubbling broths that sent savory fumes wafting into the stronghold like a slow, delicious invasion. And yes, they were very intentional with it. The stews were not just food, they were propaganda. Each day had a theme. Day 1, lentils and leeks. Simple but hearty. Day 3, roasted parsnip chowder with a swirl of cream just to taunt the nobility. Day 6, the famed venison victory stew, whose name alone caused panic in the besieged castle because, well, it suggested the attackers had already claimed the town's namesake game. You imagine the people inside, leaning from arrow slits, their stomachs groaning louder than war drums, watching their enemies stir soup like smug alchemists. The psychological damage must have been profound. By the second week, morale in the castle had collapsed. But then, the Brotherhood escalated things. They built a soup ramp. It sounds absurd because it is. But this contraption, part siege ladder, part spillway, allowed them to direct hot broth upward, cascading over the outer walls like a strange culinary waterfall. Not boiling, just warm enough to be incredibly annoying. The defenders tried to block it with boards, but the soup soaked through everything. Helmets rusted. Clothes smelled like chicken stock. One soldier's diary simply read, "The scent of time haunts me." You chuckle softly, because really, who wouldn't be haunted by rogue time in the middle of a war? But it wasn't just the inconvenience. The soup ramp signaled something deeper. The Brotherhood wasn't trying to kill them. They were trying to wear them down with ridiculousness. It worked. On day 17, the gates opened. The defenders didn't surrender traditionally. Instead, they wheeled out their own stew pot, empty, and held it aloft as a symbol of mutual respect. The Spoon Brotherhood responded by sending in hot stew and bread, under a white flag that had a ladle stitched on it. That night, no one died. Everyone just ate. Now, as you sit in this dim alcove, reading the notes scribbled by one of the Brotherhood's commanders, you begin to appreciate just how unorthodox their methods were. One entry reads, "If we feed them well enough, perhaps, they'll forget they wanted to fight." Another, "A man can hate another man's politics. He cannot, however, hate his spiced barley porridge," and, tucked into the back of the journal, a small folded piece of parchment. You open it gently. A recipe. Siege soup, 1 bucket water. 2 handfuls cracked barley wild onions, stolen if necessary. Meat, if morale allows salt, if hope remains. It ends with, "Serve hot. Serve humbly. May your spoon never bend." Of course, modern scholars argue endlessly about this siege. Some claim it was real. Others say it was invented by monastic scribes suffering from cabin fever and bad lentils. But fragments of the soup ramp were once uncovered in southern France, and in a private collection, a ladle engraved with the words "Piece by Peas" still exists. Historians continue to debate how seriously the Spoon Brotherhood took themselves. But the fact that they showed up, on record, in battle, with steaming pots and actual victory to their name, makes you wonder. Maybe they were the first true psychological warriors. Maybe they were just very hungry men with a gift for spectacle. Or maybe, just maybe, they knew something most knights didn't. That no one wins in war, but everyone wins in stew. You lean back, letting the dusty journal rest against your leg. Outside, the wind carries the scent of old stone and wood smoke. The spoon in your hand feels warmer now, like it remembers. You rise, still clutching the spoon, now less like a relic and more like a companion. It clinks against the stone as you move, echoing softly like a dinner bell in a monastery. Deeper into the ruin, you find another stairwell, this one spiraling upward. As you ascend, the walls change. Murals give way to tapestries, faded reds and ochres hanging like sleepy ghosts, and at the top, a room, round, echoing, once a tower chamber. But it isn't empty. Lining the stone walls are shields, polished to a dull gleam. Each has an emblem, a crest, or some eccentric symbol. A pot, a carrot, a ladle crossed with a feather. But the one that draws your eye shows two knights, mid-duel, spoons raised, and now you uncover perhaps the strangest chapter yet, the Great Spoon Duel. It wasn't uncommon in the Middle Ages for knights to engage in ritualized combat. Tournaments, duels, contests of strength, these were all part of the martial culture. But the Spoon Brotherhood, they elevated the absurd into ceremony. According to an entry carved into the wooden base of the tapestry frame, the Duel of Spoons was held once a year, an official Brotherhood event meant to test agility, wit, culinary knowledge, and composure. Under pudding. You squint at that last bit, but there's no further explanation. One of the more detailed documents nearby, half legible, written in a very flowery French, describes a particular duel between two famed spoon knights. Sir Melquin of the Marsh and Lady Helvice the Steady-Handed. The stakes? Custody of the Brotherhood's sacred soup stone. No magical powers, it just kept soup warm longer, which in medieval times was magic. They fought not with swords, but with custom-forged ceremonial spoons, broad-bladed, heavy, and engraved with vines. The rules were as follows. No hitting above the helmet. Each knight must maintain perfect posture. Points awarded for dramatic flair. Extra points for successfully spilling something onto the opponent in a manner deemed aesthetically pleasing. The duel was held at sunrise. An audience gathered, scribes, kitchen aides, off-duty knights, and one monk who apparently kept score using lentils in a bowl. Sir Melquin began with a bold overhead twirl, launching a glob of barley stew toward Helvice. She sidestepped effortlessly, replying with a low, sweeping ladle strike, expertly flicking gravy onto his left greave. The crowd gasped. Someone fainted. Back and forth they went. Spoon dance, stew swirl, jab, twirl, duck. Not once did they break character or smile. These were warriors, artisans. At one point, Lady Helvice executed the rare and risky double dip, scooping two sauces from two different cauldrons and flinging them simultaneously in a crisscross pattern. One landed on Melquin's chest plate. The other, well, it hit a bystander, but that was considered collateral garnish, which according to the rules wasn't penalized. Eventually, the match ended in a tie. Both knights dripping, both proud. The soup stone was cut in two. One half went to Melquin, the other to Helvice. They reportedly used them as paperweights until their respective deaths, still simmering with honor. You pace slowly around the chamber now, letting that image settle. Armored knights, flinging sauces with deadly grace, while a monk counts beans beside them. It's completely ridiculous, and yet it's kind of beautiful. The Spoon Brotherhood wasn't just playing at war. They were building a culture, a strange, flavorful, slightly damp culture, but one with rituals, respect, and rules. Modern scholars have, of course, argued endlessly over the validity of these records. One historian claimed the spoon duel was invented by jesters and later mistaken for history. Another pointed to multiple sources, monasteries in both Normandy and Catalonia, that reference the day of sauces and honor. The most compelling clue may be the armor itself. In a museum in Avignon, there's a chest plate covered in enamel. Splotches, yellow, brown, deep red. For years, it was assumed to be corrosion, until someone found a scroll identifying it as the breastplate of Melquin the Splashed. Yes, that's real. And no, it's never been conclusively disproven. You reach up and run your hand across one of the shields on the wall, this one depicting a goose holding a spoon in its beak. Beneath the motto, "Mess with the ladle, face the ladling." It's absurd, and also strangely comforting. There's something deeply human about all of this. In a world full of war and hardship, these people found space for comedy, ceremony, and community, even if it meant dueling with soup. You close your eyes for a moment. The faint scent of old herbs lingers in the air. Thyme, rosemary, and something like onion drifting down from the past. You tighten your grip on the spoon. You're not laughing at them anymore. You're listening. You step away from the shield wall, spoon in hand, your reflection flickering faintly in its curved surface. Something shifts in the air. A faint draft, carrying the smell of ash and cold stone. It draws you toward a low archway at the far end of the chamber. Carved above it, barely visible in the gloom, are the words, "Keepers of the Cutlery." You stoop and pass through. On the other side, the walls are covered in strange diagrams, maps, symbols, and illustrations etched into plaster with obsessive detail. What they reveal is both ludicrous and fascinating. Spoons as classified military technology. This section of your journey plunges you into the clandestine realm of when cutlery was classified. In an age where swords were measured by weight, balance, and poetic names like Fangs of the Falcon or Winter's Bite, the Spoon Brotherhood did something different. They cataloged their spoons meticulously. One of the surviving scrolls here lists over 150 varieties of tactical spoons, each with a ridiculous yet oddly specific purpose. There was the bowl shatterer, designed with a flattened end for smacking siege pots. The slipper ladle, hollowed for lighter weight, often used by younger recruits. And the silent stirrer, a wooden variant for stealth operations that somehow still squeaked. But among the Brotherhood, only one was considered sacred, the Royal Soup Warden. Forged from iron alloy and lined with bronze leaf, this enormous ceremonial spoon was said to have been dipped into every victorious stew made after a successful siege. It never rusted. Some said it hummed when held over hot broth. Others whispered it once bent during a truce ceremony and formed a perfect cradle for a newborn. Most of these claims are absurd, but the spoon did exist. A drawing of it hangs crookedly on the wall beside you, showing exaggerated rays of light, bursting from its bowl like holy illumination. So, why classify spoons? Well, here's where things get spicy, pun intended. You learn that the Spoon Brotherhood operated during a time of strict feudal control. Kings and generals didn't like unorthodox military units acting outside traditional structure. When the Brotherhood's stew siege tactics started winning actual battles, people got suspicious. Nobles feared the idea that feeding the enemy into surrender might become a precedent. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't inspire ballads. You can't make a heroic statue of a guy ladling gravy into a bowl. So they began to suppress the Brotherhood. Tactics were banned. Recipes were confiscated. Members were ordered to return to standard combat roles. But the spoons, they were hidden. In kitchens, in crypts, behind fake pantry walls. The Brotherhood went underground, literally. That's when their equipment, designs, and methods were reclassified, passed hand to hand like ancient secrets. One particularly hilarious memo, written in code, translates roughly to confirm shipment of 3 cauldrons, actual size, trebuchet drums. Do not stir until further notice. But what really stirs your imagination is this. Spoons weren't just weapons or props. They were symbols. They represented care, nourishment, and restraint in a time defined by brutality. To carry a spoon into battle was to say, I would rather feed you than fight you. But I'm prepared to do both, messily. You spot a small locked drawer in the corner of the room. After some fiddling and a gentle nudge with your not-so-delicate iron spoon, it creaks open. Inside, a series of tiny bronze pendants shaped like spoons, each engraved with initials. They were badges, identification, membership tokens. Some had small dents from age. Others, scorch marks. One has a bite taken out of it, which raises more questions than answers. Pinned to the inside of the drawer is a brittle scrap of cloth embroidered with a single line of text, Only the stirred remain calm. Historians have long debated whether the Brotherhood ever truly hid from authorities or if these stories are just dramatized. Some say the spoons were symbols in morality plays. Others claim they were used in real reconnaissance missions, disguising, tools of war inside kitchens. One account even suggests a member of the Brotherhood infiltrated a royal kitchen to plant pepper, which had been banned in certain regions due to its agitating properties. That knight was reportedly exiled for culinary provocation, a charge not often found in most medieval law books. Still, something about all this feels real. The sheer volume of records, the complexity of these diagrams, the wear on the spoon you now carry whose balance somehow feels perfect. It all adds up to more than legend. You take a step back from the wall and look over the entire room. Dozens of spoons, etched and detailed. Every dent and curve, every ridiculous name, the broth bastion, the noodle bender, the stirring gale. And then you notice something else, a carving low to the floor, almost hidden, not of a spoon, of a hand extended, offering it. It's not aggressive. It's open, inviting. You kneel beside it, and for a moment you can imagine what it must have felt like to be part of this order. Ridiculed, misunderstood, but persistent. Carrying not a weapon of destruction, but a reminder of care, even in the chaos. Your spoon rests in your lap. Its cold metal gently warms to your touch. The classification may be long gone, the battle tactics forgotten, but the idea still quietly simmering. You press onward, the atmosphere thickening with dust and silence. Your footsteps tap along a stone hallway that curves downward again, like a spiral spoon stirring the earth itself. You half expect the walls to begin closing in, but instead, they open into a wide, vaulted chamber with a shattered dome above, exposing a patch of night sky powdered with stars. In the center stands something unmistakably medieval and absurd. A catapult. But not just any catapult. This one is affixed with what appear to be soup ladles, giant ones. Welcome to the curious battlefield of the Catapult Conundrum. The story begins, as these stories often do, with a problem. During a siege in the region of Artois, the Spoon Brotherhood found themselves at odds with a heavily fortified garrison. The walls were high, the gates ironclad, and the defenders heavily armed with boiling pitch and sharp arrows, not exactly spoon-friendly territory. Their solution: they built a war machine called the broth lobber. It sounds ridiculous. It was ridiculous, but also, allegedly, effective. The contraption combined the base design of a standard trebuchet with an extended arm holding a reinforced iron ladle. Instead of hurling stones or fire, it launched carefully prepared canisters of hot stew, sealed in animal bladders, a medieval Tupperware, if you will. They weren't trying to kill anyone. They were trying to disrupt everything. Imagine the chaos. You're a soldier on the ramparts, scanning the enemy for signs of an assault, and then splat, you're hit in the face with hot lentils. Or worse, a cabbage and barley bomb that explodes on contact and leaves your helmet smelling like grandmother's leftovers for weeks. And these weren't just random stew splashes. The Brotherhood aimed for maximum psychological disruption. The attacks followed a strict schedule. At dawn, it was porridge, warm, gloopy, and difficult to wipe off chainmail. At noon, tomato-based broths, bright red, terrifying to the uninformed. At dusk, a thin pea soup with enough onion to disorient the enemy by smell alone. According to one scribbled testimony by a monk stationed inside the besieged city, the defenders began to fear the evening meals more than the battering rams. Another wrote, "We did not sleep. We dreamt only of stew." Now, to be fair, not everyone was impressed. A letter from a noble commander, clearly irritated, reads, "Our reputation is diminished. Our banners draped in leek. The men demand vengeance, and bread. That same noble eventually ordered a direct charge, hoping to destroy the catapult. It failed, not because of the Spoon Brotherhood's military might, but because the charge stopped halfway when his cavalry slipped on spilled stew. You can almost see it now. An elite rider skidding sideways across a field of carrots, flipping end over end, the battle horn sputtering into mashed peas. Standing here now, you inspect the remnants of what was likely one of these infamous machines. The base of the structure is still sturdy, its mechanics rusted but recognizable. You spot grooves carved into the launching spoon, lines etched in careful increments, presumably to measure soup fill levels for accuracy. Next to the machine is a barrel. Inside, incredibly, you find old containers, thick, bladder-like pouches, sealed with wax and wrapped in rotting cloth. One has a tag tied around it with faded ink. Do not reheat. You can't help but grin, because even in war, someone cared enough to make that joke. The military implications of such tactics remain, to this day, a hotly debated topic. Were the Spoon Brotherhood geniuses of non-lethal warfare, or simply culinary pranksters with too much time and not enough battlefield training? Some historians argue these stew bombs had genuine strategic merit, lowering morale, sowing confusion, and making armor sticky and uncomfortable. Others insist it was theater, war as absurdist cuisine. One researcher even attempted to recreate the broth bombs for a documentary. It ended in disaster when one exploded prematurely, staining 3 camera operators with garlic and shame. You run your fingers along the base of the catapult. The wood is splintered, flaking like the surface of an old pie crust. But you can still sense its story. Not a tale of bloodshed, but of boldness. Of a group who dared to say, "What if we fed them until they gave up?" It's easy to laugh, but it's harder to ignore that maybe, just maybe, they had a point. After all, no one truly wants to die for a castle, but they might surrender for a good bowl of stew. As the wind whispers down through the broken dome, you tilt your head to the stars. Somewhere up there, perhaps, the memory of these absurd warriors still lingers. The catapult stands silent now, but you swear, just for a moment, it smells faintly of time. The wind has changed. You feel it as a faint draft brushing your face as you descend a sloping corridor from the catapult chamber. The scent of stew is gone now, replaced by something subtler, the smell of old wood, beeswax, and bread crust. A warmth hums beneath your feet, almost like you're stepping toward a hearth. But instead of a kitchen, you enter what appears to be a dining room. A massive one. Grand, even by medieval standards. A stone hall stretches before you, lined with heavy wooden tables and benches. The hearth at the far end has long since gone cold, but ashes still curl like memory in the grate. Cups, plates, and of course spoons, so many spoons, rest where they were once set centuries ago. You have arrived at the next chapter of this strange, savory epic. Dining tables on the battlefield. In times of truce, when both sides were too tired, too wounded, or too fed up to fight, they sometimes met here. Not in this room exactly, but in others just like it. Hastily erected tents or emptied granaries transformed into neutral zones. Places where knights and soldiers from opposing sides would sit down at one long table and eat. Yes, eat. What the Spoon Brotherhood did, what they may be most famous or infamous for, was insisting that before peace could be brokered, there must be a shared meal. And not just any meal. A table meal. No trays, no rations, no eating while standing. You had to sit together with your enemy. Use real bowls, proper spoons, and pass the bread. Some historians call this idea ridiculous, others revolutionary. But it happened. The records from one notable truce at the Battle of Thistlebank describe 2 armies locked in stalemate for weeks. Both sides were down to half rations, exhausted, and sick of the rain. A spoon knight named Sir Olin of Bramblewood proposed a ceasefire for one night, a feast under canvas prepared by both camps. It was risky. No one trusted the other. But Sir Olin offered to come unarmed, wearing only his ceremonial soup apron, and bring the first pot of stew himself. He did, alone, and when the enemy didn't kill him, when they tasted the stew and realized it was genuinely good, they agreed. That night, soldiers from both armies gathered under a sprawling tent and ate side by side. Peasants, nobles, archers, cooks, all sitting shoulder to shoulder with the very people they'd tried to stab the day before. One account reads, "There was silence at first, then slurping, then laughter, and by the second bowl we were telling jokes about the weather. You walk slowly along the long table now, running your hand over its worn wood. Scratches mark the surface, some random, others deliberate. One carving reads, Pax via pultem, peace through porridge. Another, better to share bread than bleed over banners. There's even a dent in the table where someone clearly slammed a spoon too hard. You imagine the argument, that's not enough salt. A fight not of swords, but seasoning, and of course spoons were always present. In these gatherings each soldier would bring their own. It became a gesture of trust. I have not come to fight. I have come to stir. Of course, not all. These feasts ended in treaties. Some were followed by resumed hostilities. But even then, something had changed. The soldiers had seen each other not as faceless enemies, but as tired, hungry humans who liked a good bowl of lentils as much as the next guy. There's even one particularly curious case where a knight fell in love during one of these meals. He passed his spoon across the table to a woman who had been ladling stew for both camps. She returned it the next night, tied with a ribbon. They married a month later. Historians still debate whether that counts as fraternizing with the enemy, or inventing romantic cutlery diplomacy. You sit now, spoon in hand, at the head of the long table. You can almost hear them, the low murmurs, the occasional laugh, the clink of iron spoons against clay bowls. It's not the sound of victory or conquest. It's the sound of people remembering who they were before the war, and that, perhaps, was the Spoon Brotherhood's greatest weapon. Not the stew bombs or the ridiculous duels, but the insistence that even in the darkest of times, you can always sit down and share a meal. A breeze stirs the ashes in the hearth. You close your eyes, spoon resting gently in your lap. And for a fleeting moment, you're not just a visitor. You're at the table. There's a hush now, a reverent quiet, as if the stone itself remembers. You stand from the great dining table and step through an arched doorway behind the hearth. The passage here is narrow and candlelit, like something carved by monks. The air is different, too, drier, tinged with incense and dusted flour. The corridor opens into a chapel-like alcove. Small, rounded windows cast faint beams of moonlight across the stone floor, and there, beneath a faded mosaic, stands a single statue. A knight, yes, but not with a sword. He holds a spoon, cradled in both hands, bowl upward like an offering. At his feet lies a basket of bread carved into the stone. Around his shoulders, a cloak stitched with simple embroidered patterns, herbs, vegetables, tiny flames. His face is peaceful. Welcome to the unexpected spiritual chapter of this tale. Spoons and Saints. You wouldn't think of spoons as sacred. No one lights a candle before dinner to pray to the cutlery patron of ladling. But the Brotherhood? They had other ideas. In times of plague, famine, and war, when faith wavered and chaos reigned, the spoon became to them a humble symbol of constancy, of nourishment, of dignity. And yes, in some parts of Europe it was tied, however briefly, to sainthood. Take the curious legend of Saint Aelred the Stirrer, not officially canonized, not recognized by Rome, but in the villages of northern Iberia, he was venerated nonetheless. The story goes that Aelred was a wandering monk, a healer, and, most importantly, a cook. During a great famine, he arrived at a plague-stricken village where no one had eaten for days. The sick lay in the streets. The church was locked. The well was dry. But Aelred found a pot and a spoon. He gathered herbs, roots, bark, and what little grain he could find and cooked in the center of the square. Not in silence, he sang, hummed lullabies as he stirred, passed out small bowls to anyone who could still lift a hand. Some said the food had no taste, but healed them. Others said the pot never emptied, no matter how many bowls were filled. Still others whispered that Aelred stirred for 3 days without sleeping, and when he collapsed, the ladle clattered from his fingers and turned to silver. It's pure folklore, of course. Or is it because you're standing now beneath a mosaic, shattered, but decipherable, depicting Aelred surrounded by starving villagers? He stirs a pot, haloed not by firelight but a faint golden ring. One hand pours herbs, the other holds a spoon. At the base, a carved line. Blessed are the stirrers, for they shall comfort the weary. And here's the strange part. Members of the Spoon Brotherhood carried small tokens, pendants, cloth patches, even stitched prayers invoking Aelred, not for battle, for after, when the swords were sheathed and the wounded needed warmth. He was their quiet patron of restoration. This chamber was likely one such place, a post-battle sanctuary, a cook's chapel of sorts. You find cracked bowls on a side table, a ladle hung like an incense burner, and in one corner a folded parchment, a hymn, "Stir me, O gentle flame, that I may not burn, but warm. Ladle my fears into silence, season my doubt with peace." It's odd, isn't it, that, in a time so bloodied, someone thought to write a prayer about soup. Outside this sanctuary, history raged. Kings conquered, plagues spread, castles fell, but somewhere, in quiet kitchens and battle-scarred towns, there were those who stirred, who fed, who healed, who whispered, "Not all heroes wear swords, some carry spoons." And maybe that's the part we lose in the grand stories of history, the quiet kindnesses, the rituals of care, the absurd little gestures that made life feel human, even in the darkest hours. The Spoon Brotherhood knew that. They lived it. You step back toward the statue of Saint Aelred. A small bowl sits at his feet. Someone, recently perhaps, has left behind a few dried lentils and a pinch of salt. You add something of your own. Your spoon. Just for a moment. Then you retrieve it, holding it differently now, not as a weapon, but as something older, something sacred. The soft hush of the sanctuary follows you as you step back into the corridor, spoon once again in hand, though now it feels more like a relic than a relic ever should. You descend a tight spiral staircase, its walls spiraling inward like the grooves of a well-worn wooden spoon. When you reach the base, the walls have changed again. No longer stone, but charred wood and patched brick. There's a lingering smell of smoke, flour, and meat? You squint ahead. The room is dimly lit by broken skylights, beams of moonlight slashing across what looks like a massive kitchen. Iron pots hang from hooks. Rusty tools lie scattered on tables. And near the back, tucked behind a fireplace of absurd scale, you spot something you didn't expect. A suit of armor, but not just any armor. This one has spoons welded to it, strapped across the shoulders, lined down the chest like medals, one shaped into a shield, another into a helmet crest. You've just entered the tale of the Kitchen Knight. His name was Sir Roderick of Broyle, though most simply called him the Stew Bastion. Before he ever donned armor, Roderick worked in the royal kitchens. A quiet lad, raised among ladles and flame, better with time than thrusts. But when his kingdom fell under threat and the armies were drafted, he volunteered. Not because he wanted to fight, but because he refused to let soldiers eat poorly while dying in muddy fields. When the Spoon Brotherhood caught wind of him, they saw more than just a cook. They saw a future knight, and so began one of the strangest apprenticeships in medieval history: battle training in the mornings, stewcraft in the afternoons. His instructors marveled at his strength, how years of hoisting cauldrons had built, his arms like trebuchets. He was precise, focused, always calm, even when arrows flew overhead. One brother wrote, "He stirred as if the world might end if the broth burned." Then came the siege of Calston Hold. The defenders were exhausted, the attackers desperate. No food, no morale, no hope. That's when Sir Roderick acted. Under the cover of night, he snuck through the drainage tunnel and entered the fortress kitchens, abandoned but intact. He lit the hearth, found the hidden stores, began to cook. Not in silence, in defiance. When the sun rose, smoke drifted upward from the tower chimneys, and with it, the scent of something savory. The soldiers atop the wall, starved and furious, followed it down to the kitchens. There, they found Roderick, spoon in hand, ladling stew into bowls and offering them without a word. At first, they thought it a trap, but hunger overruled suspicion. And so they ate, slowly, quietly, then more eagerly. By midday, Roderick had convinced the captain to hear his proposal. Open the gates, let in the wounded, the sick, the tired, and in return, the Brotherhood would feed everyone, enemy and ally alike. It was a gamble, but the gates opened, and for 2 days no one fought, only stirred. Historians are baffled by this event. Some insist it never happened, calling it culinary propaganda. Others argue that the sudden appearance of hot stew saved hundreds of lives. There is even a preserved page from a soldier's journal, now housed in the Abbey of Les Morts, which reads, "He walked through flame, spoon raised like a torch. I would have followed him anywhere, even into the pot." Eventually, fighting resumed, such was the nature of war, but something had changed. Sir Roderick was no longer just a cook. He was a symbol, a knight whose armor was ladled with iron, sincerity, who charged not with sword drawn, but soup ladle held high. You step closer to the armor now. It's surprisingly intact. The spoons shine dully in the moonlight, their edges nicked and battered. On the chest plate is etched a simple phrase, "No blade sharper than hunger." Beside the armor lies a notebook, pages browned with time. You flip through. Recipes, battle notes, lists of herbs he wished he'd had, and near the back, a sketch of a feast hall he dreamed of building, a place where enemies could meet without fear, where the only battles were over who made the best lentil stew. You sit for a moment beside the armor, the silence deep and velvety. You can almost hear the clatter of bowls, the hum of voices, the scrape of spoon against iron pot. It's not a battle cry, it's dinner, and for a man like Roderick, dinner was sacred. You rise from beside the armor of Sir Roderick, the silence folding in like a thick blanket. There's something comforting in it now, like being tucked in after a long day of absurd stories and accidental heroism. You grip your spoon and pass, through a narrow doorway at the back of the kitchen chamber, into a cramped passage lined with oddments. Hooks, straps, metal rods, hinges, and then shelves. Upon these shelves sit pieces of armor, but not quite armor. Shoulder plates shaped like griddles, helmets with ventilation holes suspiciously similar to colanders, gauntlets etched with the patterns of cutting boards, and most notably, a full cuirass with a fork attached. You have stepped into the bewildering chronicle of when armor got forked. It was inevitable, really, as the Spoon Brotherhood's antics spread, whether through awe or mockery. Some among them began to innovate. You can almost hear the thought, if a spoon is good, surely a spork must be divine. What followed was a brief but spectacular period of experimentation known to a handful of scholars as the Cutlery Renaissance. During this era, members of the Brotherhood tried to merge culinary form with martial function in the most literal ways imaginable. You walk down the rows now, inspecting absurd prototypes. One breastplate has a built-in soup bowl, complete with a cork stopper and tiny drainage spout. Another features a shoulder guard that flips open to reveal a compartment for herbs. A helmet, too small for your head, has an attachment on the side labeled whisk storage. But the pièce de résistance? The fork-spoon harness. Designed by an eccentric knight-turned-tinker named Bertram the Blind, the contraption was an attempt to create a fully integrated culinary combat system. Here's how it worked. The left arm bore a telescoping ladle for both defense and soup delivery. The right forearm featured a spring-loaded fork, capable of extending 6 inches with a sharp twang. The chest plate opened into a fold-down cutting board. The knee guards held peppercorn dispensers. And the boots, hollowed to smuggle dried meat. In theory, this was the future of peaceful warfare. In practice, it was a disaster. During its first and only field test, the fork-spoon harness was worn by Bertram himself during a diplomatic feast with rival guild leaders. At first, things went well. He served appetizers directly from his elbow ladle, delivered salt with a flick of his shin, even carved a turnip using only his chest plate board and upper arm knife slot. But then came the incident. Someone made a joke about undercooked barley. Bertram, ever the passionate gourmand, reacted, perhaps too forcefully, with a slap of his fork arm. The spring malfunctioned. The fork flew off, bounced off the table, and landed in a bowl of custard on the lap of the Duchess of Duckwater. A diplomatic crisis ensued. The fork-spoon harness was officially banned. Bertram was demoted to dishwasher, a title which, ironically, did not exist yet. And the Brotherhood quietly retired the multi-tool armor initiative. You chuckle as you inspect the infamous harness, straps still tangled, its fork attachment now harmlessly bent. One side of the ladle is dented in, likely from Bertram's attempt to use it as a serving tray during his post-demotion exile. But you can't help admiring it, because even in failure, the Brotherhood remained true to their mission: to blend absurdity with intent, to turn function into philosophy, to believe, truly, that a man in full armor could also serve you soup without removing his helmet. Historians rarely discuss this chapter. Most dismiss it outright, or treat it as a footnote to more serious accounts. But you're beginning to understand something. The Spoon Brotherhood was never about practicality. It was about imagination, about the audacity to believe that even in war, there's room for invention, for humor, for dignity, and sometimes for weaponized tableware. As you walk back toward the corridor, the fork glints under moonlight. You pause and raise your own, spoon in salute. Not as a knight, not even as a cook, but as someone who knows, at least now, that even the silliest ideas can stir the world in the right direction. The corridor beyond the experimental armor hall is narrower, older, stones rubbed smooth by centuries of passing feet, boots, sandals, sabots, and likely the occasional spilled bowl. You feel the air shift again, cooler, drier, with a faint scent of parchment and beeswax. A staircase to your left curves down and empties into a room that feels instantly different. The walls here are lined with long, slanted wooden desks, monastic in form, studious in spirit. Quills lie like frozen, fingers beside inkwells gone dry, and in the flickering torchlight you see them: books, scrolls, manuscripts, and in one of them, pressed between pages, a small drawing of a man riding a spoon like a horse. You've arrived at a quieter but no less curious corner of history: the forgotten feasts. This wasn't a battlefield, not a camp, not even a war room. It was a scriptorium, a writing chamber likely used by the Brotherhood's most eccentric scribes, because you quickly realize they documented everything: feast menus, soup ratios, minutes from ridiculous meetings, even poetry. One page reads, "He came with soup, not sword in hand, and peace poured forth across the land." The margins, though, that's where things get wild. You run your finger down the edge of a parchment, its corner doodled with absurd sketches. A knight chasing a chicken, ladle raised like a net. A group of monks jousting with baguettes. A cat wearing a spoon like a helmet. You chuckle softly, because while official history gets carved into stone and gilded in gold, real history often hides in the margins, where bored scribes leave behind truth in jokes. One section of the scriptorium is dedicated entirely to records of Brotherhood feasts, lavish affairs held not during war, but between them. These weren't tactical gatherings. They were celebrations, commemorations of absurdity, of survival, and of stew. Each feast had a theme: the Feast of 15 Turnips in honor of an accidental bumper crop, the banquet of the burnt porridge, where guests had to pretend everything tasted fine, the quiet supper, where no one was allowed to speak until the last spoonful, and of course the legendary midwinter stew-off, in which two rival spoonmasters battled for glory using only root vegetables, limited fire, and 4 spices. The result was a tie. Naturally, one parchment catches your eye. It's a page torn from what looks like a cook's chronicle, a kind of diary. The ink has faded, but the words still hold power. They mock us, call us fools with spoons. But when the snows came and the fires died, it was we who fed them. They remember the swords. Let the soup remember us. You read that last line again. Let the soup remember us. There's something achingly human in that. A yearning not for glory, but for legacy. Not through monuments, but through meals, through warmth, through stories told in candlelight over cracked bowls. You spot a mural on the far wall, hidden behind a leaning shelf of scrolls. You push it aside carefully. It's faded, but still readable. A long banquet table. Figures gathered on both sides, but there are no banners, no crests, no weapons. Just faces, smiling, laughing, passing ladles, spilling drinks, sharing something deeply rare for their time. Peace. And at the table's head, you recognize the figure, the same man from the statue, Saint Elred the Stirrer. But here, he's older, wrinkled, soft-eyed, holding not a spoon, but a baby wrapped in cloth. The caption below reads, "When the feast is forgotten, remember the warmth." You step back into the center of the room and take it all in. The laughter in the margins, the recipes bound in leather, the notations of joy, the absurdities taken seriously. This was how the Spoon Brotherhood endured, not through battle records or bloodline claims, but through celebration, through the intentional preservation of ridiculous joy. And really, isn't that what so many people fight for in the end? A seat at the table, a hot meal, a story worth sharing. You grip your spoon a little tighter now, because maybe history does remember the swords. But you're starting to believe it's the soup that keeps us going. The scriptorium grows dim behind you as you step into another corridor, this one noticeably cooler, its stones damp to the touch, worn with the quiet tread of forgotten feet. It winds slowly, descending in gentle spirals, until the walls grow, too narrow to walk with your spoon outstretched. You hold it close now, like a candle in a crypt. Eventually, you emerge into a smaller chamber, round and squat, with shelves cut directly into the walls. Objects sit preserved in niches. Wooden utensils, bundles of herbs long since crumbled to dust, and parchment scrolls sealed with wax. But it's the object in the center of the room that stops you. A massive spoon, gleaming faintly under a skylight displayed atop a velvet-lined pedestal. Its bowl is etched with maps, its handle with dates. Beneath it, a plaque reads simply, "The Spoonsmith's Secret." You walk slowly around it. This is no common kitchenware. The craftsmanship is astonishing. A blend of practicality and art, its surface smooth as riverstone, the metalwork engraved so delicately it seems to shimmer. According to legend, it was forged by a man known only as the Spoonsmith, the Brotherhood's greatest artisan, whose real name was lost to time. A former blacksmith turned culinary philosopher, he forged spoons not for eating, but for meaning. He believed every spoon should be balanced, physically yes, but also morally. To craft a spoon without intention, he said, was as reckless as forging a sword without cause. And his greatest creation, the spoon before you. The stories say it was more than a symbol. It was a tool of diplomacy, carried into peace talks as a neutral object, offered not to stab, but to stir. In some cases, literally, leaders were invited to use the spoon to stir a ceremonial stew, jointly prepared to mark the beginning of a truce. One such account describes a meeting between 3 warring barons, each responsible for a dozen years of conflict. The spoonsmith arrived alone, spoon in hand, and challenged them not to fight, but to season. The rules were simple. Each would contribute 1 spice, each would stir once, and none could speak until the broth had simmered. It sounds absurd, and yet they agreed. Why? Perhaps because they were exhausted, or curious, or because they, like all of us, longed for a reason to believe something could still be shared. The resulting stew was reportedly terrible. Too salty, 1 spice completely overpowering, but they ate it. Together, and for 1 year, they didn't kill each other. Back in the present, you examine the engravings more closely. One line, curled around the base, reads, "To stir is not to yield, but to change." Another, subtler, is carved into the very tip of the bowl. Forged in hunger, held in hope. You imagine the spoonsmith in his forge, not beating out swords or axes, but hollowing gentle curves into steel, dipping them in broth, not blood, whispering to himself about time and diplomacy. It's said he trained only 1 apprentice, that he disappeared into the northern forests after gifting this spoon to the Brotherhood, that he spent his final years teaching bears how to cook. That last part is probably untrue, but who can say? You step back from the pedestal and take a deep breath. The air smells faintly of smoke and old time, the kind of scent that lingers in forgotten kitchens, the kind that reminds you someone, somewhere, once cared enough to feed another human, being in the middle of a war. And maybe that's why the spoon matters, because in a world obsessed with sharp things, blades, barbs, arguments, the spoon is round, gentle, not made to pierce, but to serve. The spoonsmith understood that. He didn't craft weapons. He crafted permission to pause, to soften, to remember that even the fiercest warriors get hungry, that they, too, might choose to stir rather than strike. Before leaving the chamber, you reach out and rest your hand on the base of the great spoon. Not to take it, just to feel it. It's cool, balanced, comforting in its silence. And as you pull your hand away, your own spoon, the one you've carried all this way, feels heavier, not in burden, in meaning. The chamber fades behind you, its silence settling like a flower in the air. You step forward, down a hall lined with stone arches and flickering wall sconces. Though no flames burn in them now, your path leads into a space that feels different. Again, less sacred, less solemn, more playful. The room ahead is round, its walls covered in sketches, hundreds of them. Some drawn in charcoal, others in faded ink, and a few in full color. Some are rough and chaotic, others clearly the work of a practiced hand. They all share one common subject: spoons in the sky. This is the strangest room yet, a gallery of imagination. Welcome to the story behind the doodle in the margin. It begins with a single drawing, found in the back of a Brotherhood ledger. Crude image of a knight flying through the air, spoon between his legs like a broomstick, cape flapping behind him in the wind. At first, it was assumed to be a joke, a bored scribe's moment of whimsy. But then more were found, across the continent, in monastic records, cookbooks, even tax ledgers, knights flying on spoons. Spoons with sails. Spoons suspended by balloons. A child's marginalia? Maybe. Or a movement no one took seriously, except the Brotherhood themselves. Because as you begin reading the fragments on the walls, a picture emerges, not just of silly sketches, but of attempts. They actually tried to fly. It started, apparently, with an idea from a brother named Milo of Wistford, who believed that the curvature of a well-crafted spoon mimicked the aerodynamics of bird wings. Milo, unfortunately, had no training in physics, or engineering, or reality. But what he had was time. And so, with the help of a few willing volunteers, he began building contraptions he called spoon wings. These ranged from the simple, planks, strapped to the arms with curved ladle tips, to the utterly ludicrous, a wooden glider shaped like an upside-down soup ladle with fins. The goal? To launch from the battlements during feasts and glide into enemy camps, not to attack, but to deliver pastries. Yes, pastries, often in pouches or baskets strapped to their legs. They called it the treat drop. It failed spectacularly. 1. Monk recorded, Brother Milo's trajectory was sound. His landing, however, was in the pickled turnips. Another note, pastry shrapnel caused minor confusion in enemy ranks. Still, the idea caught on among younger recruits. The margins of training manuals began to fill with flying spoon doodles. Some even claimed they had dreams of flight after stirring certain stews, a hallucination likely caused by poorly washed mushrooms. But something deeper was happening. The Brotherhood wasn't just inventing weapons or rituals anymore. They were imagining what else was possible. Not just peace, but levity. You run your hand across one of the larger drawings, a sweeping ink scene showing an entire flotilla of airborne knights, spoons outstretched, gliding over a battlefield at sunset. Below, enemy troops drop their weapons and look upward in confusion. It's beautiful, impossible, and yet, deeply moving. A quote is written beneath in the same hand. Let them look up, even if only to laugh. For laughter lifts more than wings. There's more. Pinned to the wall beside the drawing is a weathered sheet of parchment, a manifesto of sorts. Milo's final letter addressed to all who dare to imagine. He writes, you call it foolish. But foolishness is the garden of hope. What is war if not a failure to imagine? What is peace if not the stubborn insistence that we can rise above it? I flew. Not far, not high, but I flew. The final line. Let us be ridiculous. The earth has enough solemnity already. You sit for a moment beneath the wall of flight. You look up at the smiling sketches, the soaring spoons, the wide, curved wings of curved imagination. You feel something light stir inside you, something like disbelief, something like delight, because maybe, just maybe, we're all doodles in the margin. Scribbles on the edge of history, hoping to lift off just once. And tonight, in this forgotten chamber of impossible dreams, you believe we can. From the whimsical drawings of flight, you emerge into a hallway where the air feels denser again. Still touched by warmth, but heavier now, like the pause before a final course is served. You follow the flicker of torchlight down a wide passage, walls lined with faded banners depicting spoons clashing against shields, soups boiling beneath stars, and helmets adorned with ladles. There's a distant rumble in the stone beneath your feet. Not quite thunder, not quite memory. And then you see it, a mural stretching the full length of the hall. A panoramic rendering, chipped and smoke-stained, of a battlefield not of fire and death, but of food and peace. This is the tale of the last campaign, the last stir of the war. It took place, according to legend, in the twilight years of the Spoon Brotherhood, long after most kingdoms had dismissed them as culinary curiosities. Their ranks were fewer, their spoons dulled by time, and many had gone back to quieter lives, as cooks, innkeepers, potters, storytellers. But one last conflict stirred. The region of Velgrin was caught in a brutal civil war. The cities starved. The fields were ash. No one remembered what started the fighting. They only knew it had lasted too long. That's when the remaining brothers gathered, not with an army, but with carts full of pumpkins. You almost laugh, but then you see it carved into the mural, dozens of carts stacked with squash, barrels of cinnamon and cloves, cauldrons strapped to donkeys. At the center, riding a mule and wielding the Brotherhood's largest spoon, was a woman named Sister Wen of the West Bake. She was not a warrior. She was a baker, and her plan was as bold as any siege: to march straight into the dead zone between warring factions and start cooking. No declarations, no ultimatums, just pumpkin stew. For 3 days, they cooked. No one stopped them. The armies were too tired, too curious. The scent of roasted squash and nutmeg drifted across the ruined fields like incense. Soldiers crept down from the hills, cautiously, weapons sheathed, and one by one, they sat. They sat in armor and rags, cloaked in soot, scarred by years of meaningless war, and they ate. The Brotherhood didn't demand peace. They didn't ask for surrender. They just served bread, stew, warm cider. Some soldiers cried, others laughed. One reportedly said, "I haven't tasted nutmeg since my mother died." Another asked if he could stir the pot, just for a moment, to remember what still feels real. And then, quietly, impossibly, the armies left. Not in victory. Not in defeat. Just full. You walk along the mural now, each section a different scene. A knight gently placing his helmet on the ground to use it as a bowl. A child, barefoot and curious, dipping bread into a soldier's spoon. Two commanders, known enemies, toasting each other with mismatched mugs. And in the final panel, Sister Wenne, spoon held high, framed by steam rising from a cauldron. Above her head, a banner not of war, but of broth-colored silk, stitched with the words, "Let the last stir be peace." Modern historians call it apocryphal. They say the event was exaggerated, that armies disbanded for political reasons, that stew didn't change the course of anything. But they're missing the point, because it's not just about what happened, it's about what was attempted: to use nourishment as negotiation, to let warmth speak when words failed, to choose the absurd over the inevitable. The Spoon Brotherhood did not win their wars. They outlasted them by refusing to play by their rules. You pause before the last image on the mural, a spoon laid on a table, a bowl half full, a napkin folded beside it. An invitation. To sit, to share, to stop. You reach up and rest your fingers lightly on the painted spoon. It feels like something ending, or perhaps something just beginning again. The mural lingers behind you, its painted steam seeming to curl and dissipate into the quiet as you walk. The corridor narrows now, stone giving way to wood, ceilings lowering, walls leaning in. It feels almost like the inside of a cupboard, or the curved belly of a spoon. The light dims to near darkness until finally, you step into one last room. Small, circular, intimate, and at its center sits a low table. Upon it, a bowl of soup. Warm, real, fragrant. It's been waiting. You've reached the final resting place of the Brotherhood's legacy, the museum of slightly silly wars. No placards, no guided tours, no velvet ropes, just artifacts, strewn across mismatched shelves and nailed unevenly into the walls. A dented pot once used as a drum in a ceasefire parade. A spoon with a handle bent into the shape of a heart. A battle standard with soup. Stains no one ever cleaned. A diary, half recipes, half diplomatic notes, ending with the line, "Always serve from the right." And in the far corner, under a glass dome lit by a flickering oil lamp, a cracked ladle with a tag that reads simply, "Used in peace." 3 times. You take a seat before the table. There is no throne here, no crown, just a place to rest. You look down at the bowl. It smells of onions and nutmeg, a touch of salt and something vaguely floral, lavender perhaps, or thyme again, that eternal herb of memory. You don't know who made it, but somehow you know it's meant for you. Because in the end, this was never a story about war. It was about resistance. The kind that doesn't swing a sword or shout from a wall, but the kind that simmers quietly, one spoonful at a time. It was about the men and women who believed that laughter could unmake tension, that a well-seasoned stew could dissolve decades of blood, that absurdity was not weakness, but armor for the soul. They weren't foolish. They were brave. They dared to carry spoons into war, and while history forgot their names, it remembered their stories, hidden in margins, tucked into footnotes, carved into hearthstones, and etched on the underside of pot lids. They lived ridiculously, and they lived well. You lift your spoon now, the same one you've carried this whole journey. You dip it into the bowl. Steam rises. The broth is rich, earthy, honest. You taste. It is not heroic, it is not grand, it is warm, and that, you realize, was all they ever wanted to offer. Warmth in a cold and clattering world. Behind you, the walls stand silent, the artifacts still. The war stories have been told. The spoons have been stirred. All that remains is the quiet, the hum of soft breath, and the gentle clink of metal against ceramic. And slowly, your body sinks. Heavier now, sleepier. The spoon rests by the bowl. The steam fades, and the night wraps itself around you like a second cloak.